Okay, welcome everyone. It's tough staying on top of everything, isn't it? You want to grasp the big picture, economy, politics, tech, social shifts, but there's just so much noise.
Right, it's easy to feel overwhelmed.
Exactly. So you shared a bunch of really interesting sources with us, and what we want to do in this deep dive is basically pull out the key takeaways for you.
Yeah,
Connect some dots, maybe, without you having to sift through it all yourself.
think of it as us doing the filtering. We're looking at significant forecasts, policy shifts, some scientific announcements, university debates, even ethical questions around new tech, trying to see the patterns.
And yeah, the topics you highlighted are quite something. We've got Ray Dalio with some pretty sobering economic thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
discussions around Trump, El Salvador, deportation, prisoners,
Mm-hmm.
then RFK Jr. on autism research, Harvard's pushback on potential defunding, and some, well, kind of challenging stuff about AI ethics.
A real mix. So where should we start?
Let's kick off with Ray Dalio. His economic outlook seems, well, it goes beyond just predicting a recession, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. He's looking at something potentially much bigger, more systemic. He's worried about a possible breakdown of the whole monetary system, the world order, even drawing parallels to the 1930s.
Wow, the 1930s. So what's driving that level of concern for him? What are the main factors?
It boils down to a few key things. He points to the long-term debt cycle we're in. Governments consistently spending more than they bring in deficit spending, persistent inflation, and this growing gap between the rich and poor.
Okay.
And he argues, based on history, that when the world's dominant power, the one with reserve currency, prints too much money, it eventually leads to devaluation. Like, look at what happened to the British pound.
Right, that historical perspective is key. He has that analogy, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Something about being pulled
It's
toward.
the tractor beam, yeah. Like, we're being pulled towards overinflating the currency, printing too much money, and eventually the rest of the world starts looking for alternatives to the US dollar.
It paints a pretty stark picture. Is there any way out, according to him?
Well, he talks about this 3% promise idea. Basically, that a healthy, stable economy shouldn't be spending more than about 3% of its GDP just servicing its debt.
Just 3%. That sounds ambitious, given where things are.
It is. He acknowledges it's really hard to hit that target, especially considering the U.S.'s financial history post-World War II, funding the Pax Americana, and just decades of accumulating debt.
So how does this connect to current politics,
Hmm.
like the Trump administration's potential policies?
That's a really important link. You've got policies like tariffs, right? Supposedly to bring in revenue. But then you also hear talk about increasing military spending.
Right, those seem contradictory if the goal is reducing the deficit.
Exactly. It doesn't quite square with the kind of fiscal discipline Dalio is talking about, and it potentially fuels those wider geopolitical tensions he warns about, the whole Thucydides trap idea, the rising power, challenging the established one, U.S. and China, primarily.
And he has that framework, those stages of conflict escalating.
Yeah, 6 stages. He thinks we're sort of midway through stage 5 now. It progresses, he says, from political fights to economic conflict, and then the really worrying part, potentially to actual kinetic, military conflict if things aren't managed.
So the urgency is about pulling back from that trajectory, addressing the spending and the money creation.
That's his core message, yeah. Fiscal responsibility to avoid a much bigger crisis.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Another major topic in the sources was the Trump administration and El Salvador, specifically this Kilmar Garcia deportation case.
Right, that came up in the context of Trump's meeting with President Bukele. And it wasn't just Garcia. There was also this idea floated about sending U.S. prisoners to El Salvador.
Yeah, that part was surprising. But let's break down the Garcia case first. It seems complicated.
It definitely has layers. Can you walk us through the timeline?
Sure. So Garcia came to the U.S. illegally as a teenager, been here over 10 years. In 2019, an immigration court found he was affiliated with MS-13. Now, initially, his deportation was paused because of safety concerns. A rival gang, the 18th Street Gang, was a threat back in El Salvador. But apparently that rival gang has been largely dismantled now.
Ah, so the original reason for the hold is gone?
Pretty much. So the deportation is moving forward now based on MS-13 being designated a terrorist organization.
And then the Supreme Court got involved, a 9-0 ruling, but interpreted differently.
Exactly. Total agreement on the ruling itself, but what it meant was disputed. The Trump administration claimed it as a victory, saying the court affirmed their authority in foreign policy.
Ah,
But the actual court order was to facilitate Garcia's return to the U.S. because the way he was deported initially was found to be improper. He was removed before his legal options were fully exhausted.
Interesting. So the court was pushing back on the process, not necessarily the outcome?
Kind of. And some justices explicitly raised concerns about the precedent, deporting someone before the courts have finished weighing in. It raises big due process questions.
Definitely. And then there was that other part you mentioned, Trump suggesting sending U.S. citizens convicted of violent crimes.
Yeah, specifically mentioning things like rape and assault, suggesting they could serve time in El Salvador. That opens up a whole can of worms about jurisdiction, citizen rights. It's complex.
Very complex. And the source included a perspective from someone, G, with family ties there.
Yes, and that added a really valuable human dimension. G acknowledged that, yeah, things are safer in El Salvador now under Bukele, which is a major shift.
But still had concerns.
Yeah, concerns for
Yeah.
people like Garcia, who might have been forced into a gang years ago, maybe as a kid, and have built a life in the U.S. since. It's not always black and white. People get caught in the system.
It really highlights that tension between broad policy goals like cracking down on gangs and individual circumstances, that idea of needing review processes, maybe like Hamilton's view of pardons as a relief valve.
Exactly. A way to ensure justice isn't just a blunt instrument. There's this whole underlying theme about balancing security aims with due process and, frankly, avoiding potential government overreach.
Okay, let's move to the RFK Jr. announcement on autism research. Always a sensitive topic.
Definitely. He announced that HHS Health and Human Services is tasked with identifying the cause of the rise in autism by this fall.
By the fall, that's soon.
It is ambitious. And he's been critical of past studies, hasn't he? Specifically saying they haven't properly compared vaccinated versus unvaccinated kids or looked closely enough at vaccines given really early, like in the first 6 months.
Right, and his approach seems quite broad. He said they'll look at everything.
Yeah, vaccines, food, water, air, parenting styles, environmental toxins, the whole gamut. He frames the rise since the 70s as an epidemic, needing an urgent explanation, likely environmental.
And this is where it often gets controversial because any mention of vaccines and autism together immediately brings up the Anti-Vaccine Association.
Instantly. But the point was made in the source material that, well, investigating potential causes isn't automatically the same as being anti-vaccine. RK Jr. himself has talked about other environmental stuff before, like fluoride or food dyes.
True. It does raise the question, though, could we use all the data we have now, maybe with AI, to look for patterns? Sort of natural experiments in the population data.
That's an interesting thought. The potential for big data analysis is huge. Maybe find correlations that smaller studies missed. We'll have to see what this HHS investigation actually produces.
Okay, shifting again. Harvard University. President Garber's statement about autonomy.
Yeah, a strong defense of private universities managing their own affairs, teaching, admissions, hiring, research, irrespective of who's in political power.
And this seems tied into all the recent campus debates, the protests around Palestine and Israel, and the calls from some quarters to defund universities or overhaul curricula based on those activities.
Absolutely. It feels like a direct response to that pressure. But then there's the counter-argument.
Which is?
Well, that if these private universities, especially ones with massive endowments like Harvard, decide they don't want to follow certain federal guidelines or mandates, maybe they shouldn't expect federal funding. It's about accountability for public money, or at least taxpayer benefits like tax exemption.
And specific issues like transgender athletes in women's sports were mentioned as triggers too, right?
Yes, that came up as part of the context.
Yeah.
And then you had Trump's post on Truth Social.
Ah, yes. Suggesting revoking Harvard's tax-exempt status.
Right, citing what he called political, ideological, and terrorist-inspired supporting sickness. Pretty strong language.
It really throws the spotlight on free speech, academic freedom, and what conditions should apply to that tax-exempt status. The argument seemed to be for a universal policy, not just targeting institutions based on politics.
Definitely. Finding that line between protecting free inquiry and ensuring institutions benefiting from tax advantages are serving a broad public interest. It's a tricky balance, isn't it?
No easy answers there. Okay, the conversation then took a turn towards AI ethics, triggered by that. No mercy game.
Yeah, that was disturbing. A PC simulation game featuring extremely graphic violence against women's sexual violence, torture initially released, with no rating, no warning.
And it went viral quickly before being pulled down.
It did. And it sparked a much-needed discussion about these emerging ethical gray areas with AI getting so advanced, these immersive digital worlds.
Yeah.
It feels very Black Mirror sometimes.
It really does. The core tension seems to be that classic one, freedom of expression versus the potential for real harm. especially when kids could stumble across this stuff.
Exactly. The lack of ratings, the lack of effective parental controls for this kind of extreme content is a huge worry. And beyond direct harm, there's the question of what repeated exposure to dehumanizing, demoralizing content does to us psychologically.
That concern extended to future tech, too, didn't it? Like AI sex bots.
Yeah, raising even deeper questions. If they become sophisticated enough, do they have rights? What's the psychological impact on the users? It's uncharted territory.
The anecdote about Bob Flanagan, the super masochist with cystic fibrosis, was memorable.
It was definitely jarring, but it illustrated something profound, I think, about the complex links between pain, control, psychological needs, and how our desires can shift. It's a stark reminder to be mindful of what we feed our minds, psychologically speaking.
Because what we consume shapes our internal landscape, sometimes in ways we don't even realize. We think we're in control, but maybe not entirely.
Precisely. Okay, on a slightly different note, the discussion wrapped up with some thoughts from Will Smith on mindset and happiness.
Ah, right, the animals of pursuit idea.
Yeah, his point that we're wired to chase goals, but actually achieving them often leaves us feeling empty. Because the real desire, the real need, is internal.
The clifftop versus rock bottom analogy, reaching the peak of material success, can feel just as hollow as having nothing.
Exactly. His message was that real, sustainable happiness has to come from within. It can't just depend on external wins.
And that the joy is often in the striving, the journey, especially that feeling when success seems close, more than the actual achievement itself.
Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective on motivation and fulfillment. Finding joy in the process, not just the prize.
We also had those brief mentions, RFK Jr. on fluoride and dyes, that side discussion on 9/11 theories focusing on power dynamics, and just acknowledging different views on AI's impact.
Right, just rounding out the wide range of topics covered in the source material.
So wrapping this deep dive up, it feels like a few key threads ran through everything we discussed.
Yeah. Like what?
Well, these big economic and geopolitical shifts happening really fast. Then, how society's grappling with changing norms and the resulting policy debates, the ethical minefields opening up with new technology, especially AI, and underneath it all, that basic human search for meaning, for happiness.
That's a great summary. All interconnected, really.
Yeah.
And hopefully breaking it down like this gives everyone a clear picture of these complex issues without feeling, totally swamped.
That was the goal, encouraging reflection on how these different areas influence each other, the underlying forces, the potential paths forward.
So, with all that said, maybe a final thought to leave everyone with. Given how fast AI is moving, and these tough debates about online content and its effects, what principles do you personally think should be guiding us as we try to develop and use these powerful technologies responsibly? Something to chew on.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks again for sharing the sources, and thanks to everyone for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for spending your time with us. We appreciate it.